So I'm going to talk about some research that we've been doing over the last 5 years at Imperial around digital twins, digital delivery, and then also working with the Alan Turing Institute, which is the National Institute for Data Science in the UK, around data-driven approaches, particularly to infrastructure and cities. Yeah, so at the moment, I'm a co-director of the Centre for Systems Engineering and Innovation at Imperial. As Katrin rightly noted, I've actually physically relocated to Australia. So I'm going to join University of Sydney, but I'm going to retain a connection with Imperial. And this Centre for Systems Engineering and Innovation is currently co-directed by myself and Dr. Anna Midzik, who is a water engineer interested in systems approaches. And so we've been talking about that relationship between built and natural environments that I think we've just heard about in the last session. My research is very much around data-centric approaches and digital approaches. And taking a systems approach and understanding how digital can fit into that. And I've been involved in some of the policy discussions in the UK through Construction Leadership Council and around procurement of projects. So there's some work going on to put together what they call a construction playbook that's really about how do government sponsors think about procuring for outcomes rather than procuring for outputs. And so trying to shift the mindset around how we think about projects. And as I'll rehearse later in the talk, we're beginning to think about projects as interventions into infrastructure cities, into infrastructure systems. And so how do you think about projects in relation to wider systems and as interventions into those? As Katrin mentioned, I'm going to take up a role as Head of School of Project Management and Director of the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership at Sydney, and I'm very interested in projects and the role that they play in adapting our cities and infrastructure. I will still keep a role at Imperial, and so I'll continue to have a relationship with the centre and the people there. And I wanted to just motivate my talk a little bit by talking about why infrastructure and cities are important. And I think given the 3 institutes that are here in ENAC Day, people will, this will be well familiar territory for most of you, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Yeah, I think infrastructure and cities, are interesting at this moment in time as we're all beginning to re-explore our urban environments, having been in various degrees of lockdown, and reimagine our cities and our infrastructure. And what I want to explore in this talk is what role digital technologies can play in that, and where they play positive roles and where they may play a slightly more negative role. But I think, first of all, let's just have that idea about what infrastructure and cities are. And for me, one of the challenges around that kind of the way that infrastructure and cities are intervened in, if you like, is that the infrastructure complexity is growing, and I would argue that it's outpacing engineers' ability to address it. And so we have some very complex interventions into very complex systems. And I would say that the new kinds of cyber-physical complexity just add to that. And so I've been studying Crossrail in London, which has been described as, open heart surgery in a patient that's still up and running. So a very complex set of interventions to build a new railway through the centre of, an underground railway through the centre of London. and also working with major clients like Transport for London, and exploring with them some of the interdependencies that they potentially didn't even know they had with water systems, or with interdependencies between different bits of their infrastructure. And so our approach has been very much to see projects as interventions into these infrastructure systems of systems, as I was saying, and to kind of understand projects across that whole scale, from the kinds of interventions that some of the major infrastructure owners might do to their existing asset base. And here I use the example of Anglian Water, which is one of the Anglian water companies in the UK, which does, hundreds of thousands of little maintenance projects every year. So although each of those may be of relatively small value, there's an awful lot of them, up to these sort of large scale mega projects, which are increasingly over 10 billion. So High Speed 2 in the UK is a 42 billion pound project, so a really massive project, at which point national infrastructure becomes in view, and it becomes very, very, very nationally noticeable as a project. And so we've really been thinking about how digital technologies are used in this space. And I've been involved in some of the policy making around the digital twin in the UK. They've set up a Centre for Digital Built Britain, and that's really been thinking about a national digital twin programme and thinking about developing a twin of national infrastructure. So they've been starting at what I would say is quite a large scale. It's not quite the Earth systems modelling, but it's at a national scale, trying to have a twin of infrastructure. And to do that, they've been working with infrastructure owners and operators and getting them to systematize their data and to structure their data in standard ways. And they put together these, what they call Gemini principles, to think about how we put data together to build a twin. And they're pretty high level, and in some places a little bit contradictory, I would say. But what's amazing is how important infrastructure owners and operators feel that these are for explaining within their own organisation what this is about, and the way that they're trying to collate data for public good, for value creation, for insight. They have to think about security. They have to think about openness of data. They have to think about quality and trustworthiness of data, essentially. And they have to think about how they federate, curate, and evolve those data sets. And so that kind of policy making has started at the very high level. Yeah, my research team is down a few levels from that, I would say, but kind of trying to work in this landscape of thinking about what a digital twin is. And so just to share a little bit of the kind of research activities that we've had going on around this landscape of thinking about digital twin. We've been doing some work really looking at how you use building information modeling data, but you also use data that's captured from the real world, so scan data, and that you compare that scan data, that computer vision data, with the BIM data through the process to understand what infrastructure you have. So not relying solely on BIM models, which was some of the early conversation around digital twins, but using that alongside computer vision data. And so we've been looking at how you identify changes in scan versus BIM, how you calculate change propagation using a design structure matrix, how you do collaborative decision making, and ultimately how you make better design decisions using a digital twin. Now, the ideas of digital twins have come a lot out of this operation and maintenance phase of buildings. We've been interested in looking at this into delivery of projects. And so this is an area that we're kind of actively working in. And some members of my team are looking at this kind of semantic enrichment of BIM data to understand relationships between components. Some members of the team are looking at the kind of change propagation through systems. And we're also working on what's called an AEC production control room, which is about trying to make that technology available to the people that are making decisions on the site. So one problem I would argue of digital technologies is that it tends to lock all the information into little screens that we all kind of look at individually. And I think in an industry like construction, and in a sector like construction in the built environment, then it's important that those decisions are sort of taken out of our little devices and made available to democratic decision making, but also to people in the supply chain that have expertise and can be involved in different parts of that process. And so we've been very interested in my team in these sorts of large scale displays and how people can come around digital information and have conversations about it. And this is an example of one of those. This AEC production control room is set up in a couple of projects in London, and these are some of the displays that people are developing out of the data. So I'm going to just step back and talk a little bit about my work on digital delivery. So I've been looking at these kind of mega projects in the UK over the past 10 years. So from Heathrow Terminal 5 to the London 2012 Olympics, to Crossrail, to Tideway, to High Speed 2. And digital has become increasingly intrinsic to the way that these projects are delivered. And so in terms of project deliverables, I think increasingly they're thinking about delivering a digital twin, digitally enriched products and services. They're using the digital information to engage with their suppliers and get greater supply chain transparency. And they're using it in their relationships with owners and operators. And this is something that we've been kind of tracking. And I'm going to run, in the interest of time, I'm going to run quite quickly through the set of slides about these different projects, but I'm happy to talk about them afterwards or in the breakouts afterwards. So I would say Heathrow Terminal 5 is seen as a kind of seminal project in the UK for beginning to use digital information. Relatively crude technology by today's standards, but thinking about how to build large-scale infrastructure using digital as well as physical models. The Olympics, we were looking at how they then pass that data over to owners and operators, and some of the challenges of that data handover into what in London was a transformation phase after the Games, and then legacy uses afterwards. We've also been very interested in how change is managed in these large data sets, and we've worked with Crossrail on this. And indeed, we did a study comparing how that happened in our sector in a major infrastructure projects with how that happened in CERN and also how that happened in Airbus. And so we had people from Airbus and CERN and Crossrail sitting around the table discussing how they manage data in increasingly large data sets. And as these data sets get enormous, it becomes a real challenge for them to ensure that that data has integrity. And so we've been doing some work on that. And also then with another of the large projects in the UK, there's a big project to deliver a sewer through the centre of London, and we've been working with that and using their data and thinking about how you develop digital twins to understand the system. So out of that trajectory of work on projects, we've really started to then look at how can you use the data. I would say when I started doing this kind of work, people said we need to collect data to collaborate, and I think today people say we need to collaborate to collect data. Yeah, because people see other uses for the data that's being developed. And I'm leading a set of work for the National Institute for Data Science around data-driven engineering, design and uncertainty. So looking at predicting systems interactions and potential failures, model integration, problem structuring and scenario generation, bringing knowledge from operations into project delivery, managing design change, sensitivity analysis, this sort of set of interests of how do we use data to understand the systems that we're delivering. And just to rehearse a couple of projects out of that. So we've been doing some work on looking at things like design assurance and are there ways that we can engage with the kinds of documents that come out of some of these major projects to understand better how to do design assurance. We've been doing some work on what you might call very early stage conceptual design around those sorts of questions about what we should build, around infrastructures and urban mobility. So looking at using some mathematical modelling techniques to understand the kinds of mobility questions that we have around things like multimodal transport. And we've been doing some work on retrofit design in the built environment. So in trying to understand the kinds of decisions that are being made as we start to think about retrofitting domestic to retrofit our dwellings through the UK. And just one final project that to share, which is a bit of a PhD that I supervised in this kind of area. And what's interesting about this work, which is by Dr. Ranjit Soman, is that he's really starting to link data sets. So starting to link building information modeling data from different databases. So one challenge that we have in construction is that data may be owned by different people, and so the question about how to aggregate that data this is what this is looking to solve in some ways. It's looking to aggregate data using a linked data approach, and then to look at the 6-week planning horizon on site. So not the master schedule, not the day-to-day planning, but the kind of 6-week look ahead planning, and how can you do that better on the construction site. So trying to embed this information into a model for AI. So just some concluding remarks, and to leave a little bit of time for discussion. So I think the digital technology is a friend and a foe in some of the worlds that we're moving into. It sort of adds complexity into some of the systems as we're starting to put sensor networks and so on into the systems. It can be a friend in delivery, but information can kind of get locked into these devices. And I think, you know, there's questions about how quickly we can change the way we work. One of the problems of digital technologies and infrastructure projects is that, you know, even projects, never mind the operating asset, but even projects take a very, very long time, and digital technology is changing super fast. So how can we use digital flexibly to support decisions is the sort of question that I would leave you with. And I think there's new challenges and opportunities around understanding infrastructure in cities as within the built environment. And you know, the question is really how do we use data as a friend in that work? So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take questions and have some discussion.